Dane is a hardworking painter, a young man who took pride in his craft. He is married to a kind woman, and they are blessed with a beautiful girl named Vivian. Dane's wife is also heavily pregnant, and they are expecting their second child. One morning, Dane left home to buy some paint for a job he had lined up with a client, but they returned back home that morning and afternoon. His wife wasn't worried because sometimes he goes straight to work after buying supplies from the market. But when she called his phone and found it switched off, she was a little surprised because she charged Dane's phone herself. By evening, she called Dane's phone again, and still it was switched off. Vivian, who is now hungry, refused to eat her food. She crossed her little arms and shook her head stubbornly. "I want Daddy to feed me," she said. Her mother tried to persuade her. "Vivian, Daddy will be back soon, okay? Eat your food." Vivian shook her head again and her eyes filling with tears. "I want Daddy to feed me." By 9 p.m., Dane was still nowhere to be found, and his phone remained switched off. His wife worry grew into fear. She sat outside their house, staring into darkness, hoping to see Dane walking down the street with his painting tools. Then, at exactly 10 p.m., her phone rang. When she saw it was Dane calling, a wave of relief rushed over her. She picked up the call quickly. "Baby, where are you? Why has your phone been switched off?" She heard his voice, but something was terribly wrong. Dane was screaming, his voice filled with pain and fear. He sounded as though he was being tortured. "Dane!" she screamed. Fear gripped her. "What's happening? Are you okay?" Through his cries, Dane managed to say, "I got into the wrong taxi. I've been kidnapped." And the call ended. Her hands shook as she tried to call him back, but his phone was switched off again. She screamed, a heartbreaking cry that neighbors rushed to her house. Their faces filled with concern, with tears streaming down her cheeks. She explained what had happened. The neighbors were horrified, unable to comprehend the situation. Together, they accompanied her as she carried Vivian to her in-laws' house. The in-laws were shocked to hear the news. Dane's father tried calling the number repeatedly, but it remained switched off. That night was filled with sorrow, confusion, and fear. No one slept. They all sat together, whispering prayers and hoping for miracle. Then, in the early hours of the morning, the kidnappers called. Listening carefully, a deep voice said, "Your husband is with us. We don't have time to talk much. Bring 12 million naira by 12 p.m. tomorrow if you want to see him alive." Before the wife could respond, the call ended. Her body went cold, her voice breaking as she told Dane's parents what the kidnappers had said. Dane's father sat quietly, his hands shaking slightly. 12 million, he murmured. Where will we find that kind of money? The family was helpless. Dane's parents are not wealthy, and Dane himself is just a humble painter. Dane's wife sat on the floor staring at nothing. The weight of the situation crushed her. She thought of her husband and her daughter Vivian, who would not stop asking of her father, "Where is Daddy?" "Mommy, where is Daddy?" she said. Neighbors gathered again, trying to console the family, but no one had any solution. Dane's wife, already heavily pregnant and weak with worry, broke down completely, and the weight of the stress caused her to collapse, and blood poured around her feet. She was rushed to the hospital, where, after a tense wait, the doctor emerged with a grave expression. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "She lost the baby." The news shattered Dane's parents. They heard each other, crying quietly, feeling as though the world had fallen apart around them. They had lost an unborn grandchild, and their son's life is still in danger. No one ate, no one slept. Exactly 12 p.m. the next day, the kidnappers called again. "Where is the money?" the voice demanded. Daniel's father tried to reason with them. "Please, we don't have that 12 million. We are poor people. My son is just a painter, and I am not rich. Please spare his life. He is my only son." "Listen carefully," the voice said. "If you don't bring that 12 million now that your son is still alive, we will kill him, and you will still pay the 12 million before we release his corpse to you. Your son is not the only person here. We don't have that time to waste. Except you don't want to see him in this life again. After now, this phone will be switched on again by 8 p.m. Arrange the money and call. I don't want to hear any nonsense story again." Before Daniel's father could speak again, they ended the call. Tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. He prayed silently, asking God to protect his son and give him a miracle. The tension was just too unbearable for the family. That afternoon, a group of men gathered outside Daniel's home. They were his close friends, men who had grown up with Daniel and shared in his struggles. They couldn't bear to sit back and do nothing. One of them stood up and said firmly, "We can't let Daniel die. We don't have 12 million. But if we all give what we can and ask others for help, maybe we can raise something to save him." Word spread quickly through the community. People started showing up at the house with contributions: 2,000 naira, 5,000 naira, and even 500 naira. The spirit of unity was overwhelming, and soon they had gathered nearly 500,000 naira. And Daniel's father sold his 2 plots of land worth 3 million naira for just 1 million naira. At exactly 8 p.m., the phone was switched on again, and Daniel's father called. "Hope the money is ready," the voice said, and Daniel's father responded, "Please, I have raised 1,440,000 naira. Please help me. That is all I could raise from my land I just sold, and from people that contributed money. Please take it and release my son. Please." "Listen, old man," the voice said. "Your son is not the only person here, like I said before. So all these things you are saying is rubbish. But for the sake of his pregnant wife we saw on his phone, bring 5 million naira by 12 p.m. tomorrow. 12 p.m. tomorrow is the deadline, and if you fail, we will kill him and send you the video by 1 p.m. and you will still pay the 12 million before we release his corpse." And they ended the call. His heart pounded in his chest, and the phone slipping from his shaking hands. Daniel's mother fainted. They screamed for help, and neighbors rushed into the room, and Daniel's mother was carried to a nearby clinic. The doctor, a kind-hearted man who knew the family well, quickly stabilized her, but he sadly turned to Daniel's father. "She will need to stay here for observation. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. She cannot take any more stress," the doctor warned. Daniel's father nodded. He was burdened by the problems. He stayed with his wife for a while, holding her hands and whispering prayers. But he couldn't stay long. His son's life depends on him. The night was long and filled with fear. Daniel's father, restless and consumed by worry. How could he possibly raise 5 million naira in such a short time? He had already sold his land, and the contribution from the community was far from enough. Little Vivian, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, kept crying because she hasn't seen her daddy. "I want to go to daddy. Mommy, take me to daddy," she screamed. Her daughter's request broke her mother's heart, and she couldn't help but cry bitterly with her, and with doubt filling her heart if she will ever see Daniel again, even after losing her baby at 9 months of pregnancy. The next morning, Daniel's father made one last attempt to gather money. He visited relatives, old friends, even strangers, but the response was still the same everywhere. Sympathy, but no support. People were struggling with their own problems, and most of them had already supported with the little they had. By the time he returned home, he had managed to gather an additional 200,000 naira, and Dane's wife gathered 500,000 naira from relatives and friends, but the money still wasn't complete. At exactly 12 a.m., the kidnappers called again. "Is the money complete?" the voice asked. "Please," Dane's father said, "please, I have raised 2,130,000 naira. Please have mercy. This is all I could gather. Please release him. I will spend the rest of my life paying you, I promise. Please release him." The call ended. Dane's wife could barely eat. She thought of Dane, what he could be going through at the moment. The thought made her chest tighten and tears rolled down her face. At exactly 1 a.m., a video message arrived on her phone. With shaking hands, she opened it. The room fell silent as the video began to play. It was Dane. He was blindfolded, his hands tied behind his back. His face was swollen, and there were visible cuts on his arms and shoulders. A masked man holding a machete stood beside him. "This is what happens to people who don't take us serious," the man said, and the screen went black. The video ended there, leaving the family in fear. Is Dane alive, or they have killed him as they promised? Dane's wife screamed Dane's name and broke down crying bitterly. Dane's mother, who is still struggling to recover, fainted once again. Days passed, but there was no words from the kidnappers, no sign of Dane. The family was confused, haunted by the unanswered question: is Dane dead or alive? Neighbors and friends came to support them, offering prayers. Some suggested they involve the police, while some suggested they plead with the kidnappers. The days turned into a week, and the family hope began to fade. The once lively household was now filled with silence. Dane's wife barely eats, spending most of her time staring at the door, hoping Dane would walk through it. And Vivian would often sit beside her, drawing pictures of her daddy with her little crayons. Dane's father grew weaker by the day. He blamed himself for failing to save his son. Dane's mother, refusing to accept his only son Dane, is gone. One quiet evening, Dane's wife's phone rang. It was the kidnappers again, and she hurriedly gave Dane's father the phone. "Are you listening?" the voice asked. "Yes, I am listening," Dane's father responded. "Please, is my son alive?" And the voice said, "Listen very carefully. We will send you his account number right now. Transfer the 2,130,000 naira you said you raised to his account, and we will release him." A wave of relief rushed over Dane's father, though his fear didn't entirely fade. "Oh, thank you, he stammered. "I'll send the money right away, but please, is my son alive? I want to hear his voice. Please, let me speak with him. Please." There was a brief pause before the voice said, "Fine, hold on." Moments later, Dane's voice came through the line, shaky and weak. "Papa? Hello? Dane," his father called out desperately, tears streaming down his face. But before Dane could say more, the kidnappers snatched the phone back. "You've heard him. Now, send the money." The call ended. Dane's father wiped his tears quickly, waiting for the text message to come in, and he transferred the 2,130,000 naira. When he completed the transaction, he called the kidnappers to confirm the payment, but the line was switched off. The tension in the room grew heavier. What if they receive the money and still keep him? What if they still demand for more money after taking the 2,130,000 naira? Everyone kept praying and wishing for them to release him as they promised, and hoping that this nightmare will soon be over. But their worries grew with each moment of silence from the kidnappers. Finally, at midnight, the phone rang. Everyone froze. Daniel's father answered the phone quickly, his hands shaking. "We've received the money," the voice said. "You will see him tomorrow." The call ended. Throughout the night, they felt a little relief, but no one could sleep. They wish tomorrow could come very fast. The next day afternoon, while they are outside waiting, they heard voices of people jubilating. "Daniel," his mother shouted. Everybody shocked and happy to see him. As soon as Daniel saw his mother approaching, tears rolled down his eyes. He thought he would never see his family again. He saw his mother, his father, his wife, and his daughter, and tears couldn't stop. Everybody kept crying and thanking God for Daniel's safe return. He was quickly rushed to the hospital for treatment. Little Vivian couldn't go close to her daddy. She became very scared of him. She couldn't understand how her daddy lost so much weight and looked skinny. "Is this my daddy?" Little Vivian asked her mother. Her mother looked at Daniel's parents with tears rolling down her eyes. "When did you put to bed? Is it a boy or a girl?" Daniel asked his wife. "We lost the baby," she said in tears. "I was terrified when they called. I fainted and started bleeding. They rushed me to the hospital, but it was too late." Tears rolled down Daniel's eyes and his mother too. After he ate and rested when they came back from the hospital, his father asked the question everybody wants to know. "Daniel, how did it happen?" And Daniel began. "That very day, I went to my customer shop to buy paints, but he didn't have the particular one I wanted. So I entered the taxi to go to another place to buy. I was inside the taxi with 2 passengers, and a Sienna bashed the taxi from behind. The taxi driver angrily stopped immediately and parked. Immediately, the taxi driver came down from the taxi. Masked men with guns got out of the Sienna and threatened us to get in. To our surprise, our taxi driver also put out a gun and threatened to kill us if we don't enter the Sienna. That was when I realized they were all in it together. My fellow passengers and I had fallen into their trap. When one of the passengers tried to run away, they shot him dead. The other passenger and I had no option than to enter the Sienna. When we entered the Sienna, they removed our clothes, blindfolded us, and tied our hands. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear their voices. We drove for what felt like hours, and all I could think of was my wife and my daughter I left at home. Everyone in the room listened attentively, their eyes fixed on Daniel as he continues. Finally, the car stopped, and they dragged us one by one. We were pushed into a room, and I could hear the cries of other people, men, women, and even children. We stayed there for a while. After some time, they started taking us out, one after the other. When it got to my turn, they took me out, and they laid me down in the back of a trailer full of cows. "Cows?" one of the neighbors exclaimed. "Yes," Daniel said. Nobody would ever suspect that a human being was hidden there because of the cows. And one of the kidnappers laid with me, pointing a gun on my head. He threatened to kill me if I move or make a sound. The trailer drove through checkpoints. Police officers checked the driver's papers, but no one looked inside the trailer. It was a long journey that lasted for hours. When the trailer finally stopped, they took us out and transferred us into a car, which took us to a big house. They removed the blindfold. It's a very fine building. No one will ever believe that the house is used for kidnapping. They took us to different rooms and they laid me down, facing the wall. They beat me so badly. Some used machetes, some used planks, some used wire. There was nothing those people didn't use on me that very day. And I thought I was going to die. After so much beating, that was when they told me to call my wife and tell her that I've been kidnapped. Daniel's mother wiped her tears and Daniel's wife crying quietly. Daniel took a deep breath and continued. They started asking me questions, who I am, what I do for a living. I told them that I am just a painter. They requested for my Facebook name to know if I am truly a painter. And in my mind, I thank God I wasn't posting luxury or living a fake life on social media. These people wouldn't have believed I am a painter. That is why it is not good to fake it on social media. Imagine if I was posting a fake life to impress people on Facebook. The kidnappers would have thought I am a rich man. They went through my Facebook and found out I am actually a painter. They asked for my ATM pin and they took everything and left. For 1 week, I didn't see the kidnappers. None of them entered the room to check on me. No water, no food. For 1 week, I thought they just abandoned me to die. After 1 week, that was when they came in and gave me white rice with a stew. At first, I refused to eat it because I don't know if it's poisoned. But they forced me and immediately I finished eating. They beat me again till I almost died. And they left. I felt very weak, like I had no strength left. I thought I was going to die. Days later, they came in and told me to speak to my father. Then they asked me to send my account number to him. The next morning, they gave me my clothes, blindfolded me again, and put me in the car. I didn't know what to expect. I thought they might kill me and dump my body somewhere. But after what felt like hours of driving, the car finally stopped. They removed the blindfold, untied me, and handed me 7,000 naira. One of them said, "Take this and disappear. Don't think of involving the police or we'll come for your family. We still have your Facebook name." Then they got back into the car and drove off, leaving me on a deserted road. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My body was in pain, but I was grateful to be alive. I started walking, not even sure where I was. After a while, I saw an old woman by the roadside. I gathered enough strength to ask her where I was. She looked at me and said, "This is Imo State." I couldn't believe it. Imo State? That was when I realized how far they had taken me. The memory of that trailer full of cows came rushing back, and it all made sense. They had transported us from Rivers State to Imo State without anyone suspecting a thing, not even the police. I thanked the woman and asked her where I could find a bus or taxi that would take me back to Port Harcourt. She gave me directions and even prayed for me before I left. When I finally found a taxi, I used part of the money they gave me to pay for the ride back. I didn't even have the energy to explain my situation to the driver. I just kept praying, thanking God for sparing my life and asking him to give me the strength to reach home. As Daniel finished his story, the family embraced him tightly. The pain of the past weeks was still fresh, but so was the gratitude for his safe return. That night, as the family gathered for a dinner, Daniel looked at their faces. His mother, his father, his wife, and his daughter. He felt a deep sense of love, stronger than ever before. Though his body was weak, his spirit was filled with hope. Daniel knew life would never be the same after what he had endured. But he also knew that as long as he had his family by his side, he could face anything.